A flight attendant moved my mother out of first class like she didn't matter. But he had no idea who I was. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reminded them who they had overlooked. This is a story for anyone who's ever been told to stay quiet. Subscribe to the channel. We share stories that make you feel. Comment below, would you have stepped in? And where are you watching from? I was never one for theatrics. Not in the cockpit, not in life. There's a rhythm to being a pilot, a kind of cold discipline that threads itself into the way you breathe, the way you speak, the way you react when alarms flash red and a voice in your ear says, "Terrain, terrain." You don't flinch, you respond. You analyze, adjust, correct. It's not that emotions disappear, but you learn to keep them quiet, tightly packed like gear in the hold. That morning, I landed at O'Hare just after 6. The sun was barely up, and the jet bridge was still coated in the stale air of recycled red eyes. I'd come in from Tokyo, a 14-hour flight, heavy with time zones and customs paperwork, and my body was humming with the peculiar ache of having been responsible for 200 lives through storms and silence. Still, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. My mother was on her way, and I was going to be there not as a captain, not as a professional, but as her son. Her name is Marilyn Maynard, 79 years old, former public school teacher, lives alone in a small house in Denver with blue shutters and a front porch that always smells faintly of pine cleaner and overripe tomatoes. My father died 9 years ago, and since then she's managed things on her own. The taxes, the furnace maintenance, the doctor visits. She never complains. If she's tired, she says she's a little creaky. If she's lonely, she mentions the mail carrier says hello more often these days. A week ago, when my daughter Lucy told us she'd landed a part in her school play, nothing fancy, just a community theater thing in Nyack, my mother immediately said she'd come. I promised I'd never miss her stage debut, she told me on the phone, and I could practically hear her brushing lint from her lapel as she spoke. She didn't ask if it was a good time. She didn't mention the fact that flights wear her down more than they used to. She simply said, "I'll be there." I booked her seat myself. First class, seat 2A, window, not because she needed pampering, but because her spine had begun whispering protests during long sits, and I knew the coach seats would leave her stiff and aching by the time she landed. She resisted at first. "Edward, I'm not some dowager duchess," but I insisted. She relented after I said, "It's not about luxury, Mom. It's about comfort and peace of mind." Mind, mostly. I was assigned seat 2B. I wanted to be near her, not hovering, just close enough to help if she needed anything. That's something you understand better as you age. Not how to help, but how to stay quietly present. Sometimes presence is enough. As I left the arrivals terminal and crossed into the connecting gate area, I pulled out my phone and checked her boarding status. She'd boarded 10 minutes earlier, on time, reliable as always. I could already picture her. Small handbag clutched close, coat collar straight, brooch in the shape of a sparrow pinned neatly in place. Her hair would be pulled back in that no-nonsense bun she'd worn for most of her teaching career. She always said, "Vanity fades, dignity doesn't have to." Gate B17 was already flashing final boarding. I picked up my pace. My bag thumped rhythmically against my thigh as I moved through the thinning crowds of early business travelers. A stewardess held the jet bridge door for me as I approached. "Good morning, sir," she said, scanning my boarding pass. I nodded politely and stepped into the narrow corridor. The smell hit first. The faint mix of coffee, deodorant, and carpet that every plane seems to carry no matter how new. I walked down the short hallway into first class. My eyes immediately flicked towards seat 2A. It was empty. For a second, I thought I'd gotten the seat number wrong. I checked my pass again. No, 2B. Hers was 2A. My seatmate was present all right, an older man with a travel pillow already behind his head, scrolling through stock charts on a tablet. But the seat beside him was unmistakably unoccupied. I turned to the nearest flight attendant. She looked to be in her early 30s, a bit rushed, her name tag tilted slightly. "Excuse me," I said, voice calm. "Do you happen to know where the passenger assigned to 2A went?" "My mother." She blinked once. "Oh." "I think she was reseated," she said, flipping through the small tablet in her hand. "Looks like there was a last-minute seating issue. Someone else was assigned the seat at the gate." "That's not possible," I said. "She checked in yesterday. She was issued that seat." Her expression faltered slightly, but not much. "Sometimes the system overrides," she offered, clearly wanting to move on. "She's seated farther back, I believe." "Where, exactly?" She hesitated. "I can find out. One moment." I stepped aside, letting a pair of passengers through. My heart was beginning to tighten, not in a panicked way, but with the slow pressure of something deeply wrong. My mother would not have argued. If someone asked her to move, she would have simply smiled and obeyed. She would have thought, why make trouble? The flight attendant returned. "She's in 28B. Middle seat?" "Yes, sir." I gave a slight nod and turned without another word. The curtain dividing first class from the rest of the cabin drew aside with a soft whisper as I passed through. The change was instant. The plush spacing of first class gave way to rows crammed tight, knees brushing seatbacks, elbows held close out of survival instinct. People were already settled in, headphones on, eyes glazed over with early morning fatigue. I moved past them, eyes scanning the row numbers 20, 23, 26. There, row 28. She was sitting exactly as I'd imagined, back straight, hands folded on her lap, coat still neatly buttoned. But her gaze wasn't fixed out the window or on a magazine. She was staring at the seat in front of her, blankly, as if trying to disappear into the plastic and mesh. On one side, a large man was already snoring, his shoulder bleeding into her personal space. On the other, a teenager hunched over her phone, knees up, earbuds in, backpack wedged beneath her feet. "Mom?" I said, leaning in gently. She turned, blinking once, then smiled with that soft expression that had comforted me through childhood fevers and adolescent heartbreaks. "Oh, Edward, you made it." "I said I would," I replied quietly, crouching beside her. "Why are you back here?" "They said my seat was double booked, some kind of mix-up." Her voice dropped slightly. "It's all right. I didn't want to be a problem." I looked at the limited space she was crammed into, the overhead bin half open above her, the frayed seat fabric, the noise. "You're not a problem," I said, my voice tighter than I meant it to be. "I know," she said gently, "but sometimes it's easier to move than to argue." I stood up, jaw clenched. My training kicked in again. Not the part that knew how to land a 777 in a crosswind, but the part that understood control, timing, clarity. I extended my hand. "Come with me." She looked hesitant, then sighed, but took it anyway. The path back through the plane felt longer than before. I guided her ahead of me, shielding her from passing elbows and overhead bags. The curtain swished again as we re-entered the front of the aircraft. The flight attendant from before approached, already uneasy. I could see her mouth open to speak, but I raised a hand slightly. "I'd like to speak with your cabin manager," I said quietly. She hesitated, then nodded and disappeared into the galley. My mother stood beside me, eyes forward, silent. I didn't need to explain. Not yet. I just needed someone to listen. Because my mother mattered long before I stepped on this plane. She mattered when she sat at her kitchen table in Denver, wrapping her scarf just so. She mattered when she paid for her ticket, confirmed her seat, arrived early, and stepped on board with dignity. She mattered before anyone knew I was a pilot. Before anyone knew I was watching, the cabin manager approached with the brisk, clipped gait of someone used to complaints but rarely concerned by them. Her uniform was immaculate, navy pressed to razor creases, and a metal name tag glinted above her chest pocket, F. Richards. She looked between my mother and me with a mix of formality and faint irritation, like we'd disrupted a very efficient system she preferred to run without interruption. "Good morning, sir," she said. "I understand there's a concern about your mother's seat?" "That's correct," I replied. My voice didn't rise. I didn't gesture or project. I simply looked at her the way I'd looked at first officers who missed details in approach briefings. Direct, patient, but not yielding. She was ticketed and checked into seat 2A. She boarded on time, yet she was moved to row 28 without explanation or assistance. The manager offered a practiced smile, the kind reserved for pacifying the mildly dissatisfied. Yes, unfortunately, there was a last-minute seat reassignment due to an overbooking situation. It appears another passenger was assigned to 2A at the gate. I do apologize for the inconvenience. I didn't blink. And what protocol was followed when removing an elderly woman from a confirmed seat? There was a pause, short but telling. She shifted slightly. "We understand your frustration, sir. I assure you, this was not personal. Sometimes gate systems override cabin assignments when manifest loads change. It's not ideal, but it happens. I didn't need an education in airline logistics. I've flown with more flight plans than most of the people in this cabin will see in a lifetime." I knew what she said was technically true, but I also knew that policies are written with choices hidden inside them. Choices about who gets prioritized, who gets ignored, and who gets told without words that they're expendable. "My mother wouldn't have protested," I said. "I know that. She was raised to follow rules, but that doesn't make this acceptable. She's not a seat number. She's a person who deserved better than to be pushed to the back of the plane like forgotten luggage." The manager opened her mouth, perhaps to offer another rehearsed apology, but I raised my hand a fraction. "I'm not looking for a free voucher or a points credit," I continued. "What I want is for her to be returned to the seat she paid for and was promised." She looked uncertain now, not panicked, but stalled. I could see her mind working, calculating delays, customer service chains, escalation risks. I waited. There's power in silence when you understand how to use it. Finally, she nodded once. "Please allow me a moment to confer with the crew." She turned away briskly, disappearing toward the front galley. My mother stood beside me, her posture still straight, her hands folded calmly over the handle of her handbag. She hadn't said a word since we left row 28. She didn't need to. I looked at her then, not in frustration, not in pity, just in recognition. Of all the times in my life she had walked ahead of me, straight-backed and sure, through grocery stores, school plays, parent conferences, hospital corridors, always composed, always small, but always somehow holding everything together. And now here she stood, quiet and waiting, while someone half her age decided whether she was worth returning to where she belonged. The manager returned minutes later, her voice more subdued. "We've spoken with the passenger who was given 2A. He'll be reseated elsewhere. Your mother is welcome to return to her original seat." I nodded. "Thank you." Without waiting for further invitation, I turned to my mother and gestured ahead. She moved past me, slowly but with dignity. I followed her down the aisle of first class, where no one said a word, but several pairs of eyes followed her now, curious and perhaps a little ashamed. The man who had been in 2A was already gathering his things. He didn't protest, didn't look at us, just stood and moved aside. My mother lowered herself into the seat with deliberate care, adjusting her coat as she settled into the cushions. I took 2B beside her. "Are you all right?" I asked quietly. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, it's good to see you." It should have ended there. But the moment didn't go unnoticed. Someone across the aisle, a man in his 30s, dressed in a sharp gray suit, had taken a picture. I saw the faint glow of his screen as he tapped at his phone. I didn't think much of it. In my line of work, people document everything. But this felt different, less opportunistic, more like witnessing. I closed my eyes for a moment and exhaled slowly. My heart was still tight, my hands curled on my thighs, not from anger. Anger is useless at 30,000 feet, but from something deeper, something like sorrow. I had known, even as a boy, that the world didn't always notice people like my mother. She was the kind of woman who brought extra gloves to school in winter in case one of her students forgot theirs, who wrote letters by hand, who stood patiently in post office lines and never used the self-checkout because she liked to thank the clerk. She was old-fashioned, not in speech, but in presence. She moved carefully, she listened first, She expected decency and gave it freely. In this world, it was faster now, louder, more efficient. It didn't stop to see her anymore. The cabin lights dimmed. The captain's voice, smooth and impersonal, came over the intercom. We were cleared for departure. Flight time to New York was just under 2 hours. The flight attendants made final checks. My mother folded her hands in her lap again and looked out the window. "I never mind flying," she said softly, "but I do mind being moved like I don't count." I turned toward her. "I know," I said. "That's why I didn't let it stand." Her expression didn't change, but I saw something behind her eyes, a flicker of weariness. Not physical, but soul deep, as though this had happened before, in different ways, in quieter places, and I had simply been lucky enough to catch it this time. As the plane began its slow taxi, I noticed movement to my left. The man who had taken the photo leaned slightly forward, as if debating whether to speak. He didn't, but he did nod, almost imperceptibly, toward me. I gave a slight nod in return, an unspoken recognition. By the time we lifted into the sky, I'd mostly forgotten about the moment. I focused instead on my mother, who leaned gently against the headrest, her eyes closed, not asleep, but resting. I let my own body sink into the seat, the hum of the engines soothing in a way only pilots truly understand. We didn't speak for a while. 30 minutes into the flight, something changed. I noticed it first in the soft murmur of voices across the cabin, then in the faint buzz of phones passed between seatmates. One woman leaned toward her husband, showing him her screen. A college-aged man 3 rows ahead opened Twitter, browsed quickly, and leaned back with widened eyes. Across the aisle, the man with the suit sat very still, his phone still open in his palm. The screen displayed a post, a photo, my mother and me, captioned simply, "This elderly woman was bumped from her seat without explanation. Then her son boarded. He didn't yell, he just made it right." I didn't know what was happening outside that aircraft, but something had shifted. I turned toward my mother again. She was awake now, sipping ginger ale quietly from a plastic cup. Her hands were steady, her posture relaxed. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked. She shook her head. "Let them talk," she said. "I'm tired of people only listening after someone brings a microphone." I looked out the window at the clouds unrolling beneath us like crumpled linen. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't the one flying, but I was still navigating, and the route ahead was changing fast. By the time the plane began its descent into New York, the photo had made its way to thousands of phones. I didn't know it yet, but while my mother and I sat quietly in our reclaimed seats, a quiet storm was building on the ground. The story wasn't about a simple seating error anymore. It had grown teeth, found resonance, and threaded itself into something larger, something that spoke to people who had seen too much and been seen too little. Still, in the moment, we were just 2 passengers. My mother stared out the window as the lights of the city began to glow beneath us, the sprawling shape of Manhattan stretching long and lean in the distance. Her face, caught in reflection on the plexiglass, looked strangely younger in the fading light. There was a softness in her features, but also something immovable, resilient. The plane landed with a smooth double bump, and I felt the weight of inertia settle into my chest. I had spent my career bringing strangers down safely through turbulence and snow, had maneuvered through electrical storms and cabin depressurizations, but somehow nothing had ever felt quite like that moment of stillness. Sitting beside my mother as the aircraft slowed on the tarmac, the seatbelt sign still lit, the phones beginning to blink back to life. The cabin lights brightened gradually. The crew began their familiar script, thanking us for flying, reminding us to check the overhead bins, inviting us to stay seated. My mother reached for her handbag with calm, precise movements. I helped her stand. There was no ceremony to it, no fuss. But I could feel the eyes. They weren't staring, exactly, not all of them, but people were aware now, more aware than they would have been 30 minutes earlier. A man from row 4 offered to help my mother with her bag. Another nodded politely as we stepped into the aisle. Neither spoke directly about what had happened. They didn't have to. Something had shifted in the air, imperceptible but present. At the gate, as we waited for her carry-on to be brought up from the plane-side cart, I opened my phone out of habit. Dozens of notifications, messages, tags, my name mentioned alongside hers. I scrolled slowly, brows furrowing as I began to piece together what had happened in the cabin while we were flying above the clouds. The original photo had been posted by a man named Daniel Morales, a software developer returning from a conference. He'd been sitting across the aisle and said he couldn't ignore what he'd witnessed. The caption was short, almost clinical, but it had touched a nerve. This woman was asked to move to the back of the plane. Her son boarded and calmly insisted she be returned to her seat. He never raised his voice, but something about the way he stood changed everything. Turns out, he's a commercial pilot. There was something in that detail, my profession, that caught fire with the public. Perhaps it gave the story structure, a sense of irony, the son of the sky, forced to intervene on the ground, the man trusted with control of an aircraft, now fighting for a seat. I didn't love the attention, but I understood why it resonated. My mother, as always, remained still and unbothered. She wasn't scrolling. She didn't ask questions. She stood beside me, her fingers resting on the strap of her bag, watching the other passengers move through the terminal. The buzz of the airport pressed around us, but she seemed untouched by it, like someone walking beneath falling snow without getting wet. We walked together toward the connecting gate where we'd wait for her next flight to Nyack. I wasn't flying that segment. She'd go the last leg on her own, a short hop on a commuter plane. I was staying overnight in the city for work meetings the next morning, but I didn't want to leave her until she boarded. We sat in a quiet corner by a window. She crossed her ankles neatly, folded her coat over her lap. I offered to get tea. She declined. "You don't want anything?" I asked. She shook her head. "I have everything I need." For a long time, neither of us spoke. I kept reading. The post had been retweeted over 70,000 times. People were quoting it, debating it, applauding it. News outlets had picked it up. A journalist from the Associated Press had written a short piece framing the story as emblematic of how older passengers were often deprioritized by airlines. Others were more personal, threads from people who had watched their parents or grandparents be ignored, displaced, dismissed. One man wrote, "My dad used to wear a WI veteran pin when he flew, just so someone might give him an ounce of decency. He never wanted special treatment, just not to be forgotten." Another woman shared, "I saw this happen to my grandmother once. She was moved from her aisle seat because a younger guy complained he needed more legroom. She didn't say a word. She never flies anymore." Somewhere in the midst of it all, a reporter uncovered that I wasn't just a commercial pilot. I had worked as a senior training captain for a major airline and had co-authored several safety protocols. That added fuel. Suddenly, the story wasn't just about a son. It was about an insider, someone who knew the system and saw it fail. I closed my phone and slipped it into my jacket pocket. My mother turned to me, her expression unreadable. "Is it spreading?" I gave a small nod. "It is." She sighed, but not heavily. "I didn't want this to become a thing." "I know," I said, "but it's not just about us now." She looked out the window again. "People should be decent, even when no one's watching." "My should," I agreed. "And if they're not, it's not because they don't know better, it's because they're busy thinking someone else matters more." She paused, then added, "I didn't speak up because I figured you'd be there soon, but what if you hadn't been?" I didn't answer. That was the question, wasn't it? She looked back at me, her voice soft. "Don't let them make this about your name or your job. Don't let them miss the point." "I won't." But I didn't know how to make sure of that. Later that evening, when I got to my hotel, my inbox was flooded. Journalists, PR reps, colleagues, former students of my mother's who'd recognized her face, strangers, hundreds of strangers. And in the center of it all, a question forming louder and louder in my mind. If this many people had seen themselves in what happened to her, how many others had gone unnoticed? I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, after my meetings, I sat down in the hotel's quiet lounge with a black coffee and my laptop. I opened a blank document and started to write. Not a statement, not a defense, just a reflection. I wrote about my mother, about how she had raised me on a single salary, paid off her mortgage by cutting her own hair, taught public school for 40 years and never once lost her temper in a classroom. About how she'd baked cookies for every neighbor who lost a spouse and sent birthday cards by mail, always with a note inside, never just a signature. I wrote about the seat, about how it wasn't the leather or the legroom that mattered, it was the principle. She had been promised a space and someone decided she didn't deserve it. I ended the post simply. My mother mattered before I stepped on that plane, before anyone knew I was a pilot. She mattered the moment she showed up with dignity, and she deserved to be seen. I clicked publish. By lunchtime, it had been shared over 100,000 times. The airline responded with a public statement by the afternoon. Apologies were made, internal reviews promised. They called it an unfortunate procedural oversight, said they were re-evaluating passenger priority practices. It was clean, safe, predictable. But the public wasn't buying it. Comments poured in. She didn't need an apology. She needed her seat. Why does it always take outrage for decency? How many others were moved and never had someone watching? In the following days, the story remained alive. Editorials ran in major newspapers. Talk shows brought on guests to discuss the treatment of elderly travelers. Flight attendants, anonymously or not, wrote about the quiet culture of dismissing passengers who didn't push back. Some shared similar incidents. One even admitted to having done the same and regretted it ever since. I received hundreds of personal messages. A woman from Arizona said she printed the story and left it in her church bulletin. A man in Vermont said it made him call his mother for the first time in months. A high school civics teacher in Trenton told me he was using the story in his unit on ethics. None of this was what I intended. But maybe, I thought, it was necessary. Because if people like my mother were used to being moved out of the way, maybe it was time someone stood still and said, no more. Not because of status, not because of headlines, but because everyone deserves to be seen. Not just when they raise their voice, but especially when they don't. I don't remember exactly when the phrase, the return point, came to mind. Maybe it was sometime between the fourth email from a journalist and the second letter from a stranger in Idaho who'd mailed her story on thick, lined paper with perfect cursive. Maybe it came to me in the quiet after my mother's flight took off from New York, when I sat in the terminal and watched her plane taxi out, small against the tarmac, silver and vulnerable, but rising all the same. All I know is that the phrase stuck. I had spent most of my life calculating routes forward, but this was the first time I felt I had landed somewhere that asked me to look back. In the days after the post, the noise didn't die down. It evolved. The airline's apology triggered its own wave of reactions. Some called it hollow, others defensive, but most agreed it was too late. My mother didn't want a refund. She didn't want free miles. She wanted what was fair. She got her seat back not because a policy changed, but because someone watched. That was the part no one could unsee. The inbox on my work email became impossible. My phone buzzed itself to exhaustion. Messages came in from retired flight crews, accessibility advocates, professors, even a state senator who wanted to connect. But I didn't respond to most of them. I wasn't trying to become anything other than what I had always been, a man who loved his mother and knew when silence had overstayed its welcome. One afternoon, while sitting at my kitchen table, surrounded by half-drunk coffee cups and a pile of unopened letters, I received a call from a member of my company's board. She had always been candid with me, more grounded than most in our field. "Ray," she said, her voice direct, "your silence is starting to sound like strategy." "It's not," I replied. "I believe you," she said, "but people are waiting." I hung up, sat in that silence again, and realized I had been avoiding the very thing I was trained not to avoid: decision. My mother hadn't asked me to speak for her, but what had happened wasn't just hers anymore. It had become a lens, and like any good pilot knows, when you see turbulence ahead, you don't wait for impact. You prepare. You warn others. You make adjustments. So I did what I knew how to do. I planned. With the help of a few people in my industry, we began crafting a quiet initiative, one not built on media coverage or flashy branding. We called it Flight Watch. The name was simple, but the purpose wasn't. The goal was to implement discreet, human-centered checkpoints for vulnerable passengers, especially elderly and disabled travelers, at multiple stages of the flight experience. Not security-based, not medical, just ability, recognition. We worked on prototypes for feedback tools, seat change alerts tied directly to passenger consent, optional, discreet check-ins for passengers over a certain age, direct communication protocols between ground staff and cabin crew to track flagged sensitivities, not allergies but dignity risks. Every detail came from real stories we'd collected. And we didn't announce it. We didn't seek press. We just started. Meanwhile, my mother remained where she always had been, at home. She didn't ask about the view counts, the op-eds, or the corporate replies. But every evening, I called her. Sometimes we talked about the story, sometimes we didn't. But she always asked how I was holding up, as if it were me who'd been displaced. Then one evening, something new happened. I was sitting at my desk, wrapping up a call with the advisory panel when I got a message from an intern at a small publication. She was young, nervous, and apologetic. She didn't want a sound bite, she just wanted to meet my mother. Not for an interview, not for a headline, for perspective. Surprisingly, my mother agreed. The girl, her name was Elise, drove 2 hours through late spring rain to reach her. She didn't bring a camera, she brought tea. And when they sat together, she didn't take notes. She listened. And my mother, in the way only she could, spoke. "Why didn't you say anything?" Elise asked gently. "Because I've learned," my mother said, "that sometimes when you raise your voice, people stop listening. But when you move quietly, they start to wonder why." That line made its way to print, tucked deep into an editorial about generational dignity. It didn't trend, it didn't go viral, but people read it. I know, because more letters came. One from a retired nurse in Peoria talked about how often older women were pushed aside in emergency rooms, not by cruelty but by oversight. They assume we'll be patient, that we'll understand, but sometimes we hurt in silence until it becomes habit. Another, from a teenager in Oregon, read simply, "I saw what happened to your mom, and I thought of mine. I never used to see her, now I do." My mother began keeping the letters in an old cookie tin that had once held buttons and spare thread. She didn't tell me what she planned to do with them, but she read every single one. One Sunday afternoon, I drove to her house. She was in the backyard garden, wrapped in a quilt, her tea steaming beside her. The breeze was gentle, the air smelled like earth and lilac. I watched her for a moment before she noticed me. Her gaze turned not toward the house or the gate, but outward, toward the fence where the tomato patch used to grow. "You know," she said without turning, "I keep thinking about that flight, not because of what they did, but because of what it became." I sat beside her in the wicker chair. "You mean the reaction?" She shook her head. "I mean the story people saw in it. It wasn't just about me, it was about them." "I've been thinking about that too," I said. "All the people who wrote, the ones who said it reminded them of someone they loved, or someone they failed to speak up for." She nodded. "Most people don't want revenge. They don't want apologies either. They just want to stop being invisible." I was quiet then. I'd spent years being the one in control of everything from airspeed to trajectory, but in that moment, I felt small in the best possible way, like a student relearning what mattered. "You weren't invisible," I told her. She looked at me. "That day I was." I swallowed hard. "But you helped me be seen again," she added. "You and everyone who didn't look away." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The wind moved softly through the leaves, and the sound of birds settling into feeders filled the silence like a hymn. Later that night when I got home, I found a letter waiting on my porch. No return address. Inside, it held a single sentence. "Thank you for showing us stillness isn't the same as absence." I folded it and added it to the pile. The final ripple came 3 months later when a young woman named Devin Mallory, who'd been sitting in 28F on the same flight as my mother, published an essay. She admitted she'd seen it happen, had glanced up, noticed the movement, and looked away. Not out of malice, out of conditioning. "I thought it wasn't my place," she wrote. "She didn't cry, she didn't yell, she just stood." And I let her. But I couldn't stop thinking about it afterward, about how many times I've looked away. I want to do better. I will do better. That essay didn't go viral either, but my mother read it. Elise had printed it for her and mailed it in a small envelope with a pressed flower tucked inside. My mother folded the essay gently and placed it at the top of the cookie tin. Then she closed the lid, though now it no longer quite fit. I asked once, softly, if she ever wanted to fly again. She smiled. "I think I've gone far enough for now." And I understood, because sometimes the journey isn't in the miles traveled, it's in the moment someone chooses to see you and doesn't look away. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. We share real stories that remind us what it means to care, to see, and to stand up for one another. Watch our next video. You never know whose story might stay with you. And if this one made you think, share it. Someone else might need to see it too.